I never thought I'd end up here, trapped in my own home at 75 years old. My name's Margaret, and this is my story. It was my birthday. 75 years on this earth, and what did I have to show for it? A daughter who treated me like a servant and a life that felt more like a prison sentence. I woke up that morning, my bones creaking as I pulled myself out of bed. The house was quiet, too quiet. Sarah, my daughter, was probably still asleep. She always slept late, expecting me to have her breakfast ready when she finally decided to grace the world with her presence. As I shuffled to the kitchen, I couldn't help but hope. Maybe, just maybe, she'd remember this year. Maybe there'd be a card, a small cake, even just a happy birthday, Mom. But deep down I knew better. The kitchen was a mess as usual. Dirty dishes piled high in the sink, takeout containers scattered across the counter. I sighed, tying on my apron. No rest for the weary, especially not on your birthday. As I scrubbed and cleaned, my mind wandered to happier times. My late husband's warm smile, family picnics in the park, Sarah's laughter as a child. Where had it all gone wrong? The sound of heavy footsteps broke me from my reverie. Sarah appeared in the doorway, her hair a tangled mess, still in her pajamas despite it being nearly noon. "Where's my coffee?" she snapped, not even bothering with a good morning. I turned, forcing a smile. "Coming right up, dear. How did you sleep?" She grunted in response, plopping down at the kitchen table and burying her face in her phone. I placed the steaming mug in front of her, my hand trembling slightly. "Sarah," I began, my voice barely above a whisper, "do you know what day it is?" She glanced up, annoyed. "Tuesday? I don't know, why does it matter?" My heart sank. "No reason," I mumbled, turning back to the stove to hide the tears welling up in my eyes. As I cooked her eggs just the way she liked them, I couldn't help but wonder how we'd ended up here. When had my sweet little girl turned into this demanding stranger? And when had I become so afraid to stand up for myself? The doorbell rang, startling us both. Sarah groaned. "Who the hell is that?" "Mom, go answer it." I wiped my hands on my apron and made my way to the front door, my heart pounding. We never had visitors. Sarah had made sure of that, driving away anyone who tried to check on me. I opened the door and my jaw dropped. There, standing on the porch with a suitcase and a big grin, was my brother Frank. "Happy birthday, Maggie," he boomed, pulling me into a bear hug. For the first time in years, I felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. Here's the second chapter of the story. Frank's unexpected arrival was like a breath of fresh air in my stagnant life. As he hugged me tightly, I felt tears welling up in my eyes, not from sadness this time, but from a mix of relief and joy I hadn't experienced in years. "Frank," I whispered, my voice shaky, "what are you doing here?" He pulled back, his familiar blue eyes twinkling with mischief. "Did you really think I'd forget my big sister's 75th birthday? Not a chance." Before I could respond, Sarah's voice cut through the moment like a knife. "Mom, who's at the door?" I tensed up immediately, my brief moment of happiness evaporating. Frank must have noticed because his expression changed, a frown creasing his forehead. "Is that Sarah?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Frank squared his shoulders and marched into the house, pulling his suitcase behind him. I followed, wringing my hands nervously. Sarah was still at the kitchen table, her face a mask of annoyance as we entered. Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of Frank, but she quickly schooled her features into a look of bored indifference. "Uncle Frank," she said flatly. "What a surprise." Frank's smile never wavered, but I could see the steel in his eyes. "Sarah, it's been too long. I'm here to celebrate your mom's birthday. You were planning something special, right?" Sarah's face paled slightly. She glanced at me, then back at Frank. "Of course," she lied smoothly. "We were just about to go out for lunch." I blinked in surprise. We hadn't been out to eat in months, maybe even years. Sarah always said it was too expensive, even though she frequently ordered takeout for herself. Frank clapped his hands together. "Wonderful. I'm starving after that long drive. Shall we get going?" For a moment I thought Sarah might refuse. But with Frank there, she had no choice but to play along. "Sure," she said through gritted teeth. "Let me just get changed." As Sarah stomped off to her room, Frank turned to me. His eyes softened as he took in my appearance, The worn apron, the deep lines on my face, the slight tremor in my hands. "Maggie," he said gently. "What's been going on here?" I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. How could I explain years of subtle manipulation, of slowly losing my independence, of becoming a prisoner in my own home? Frank seemed to understand even without me saying anything. He squeezed my shoulder gently. "It's okay, sis. I'm here now, and we're going to figure this out." For the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe with Frank here, things could change. Maybe I could reclaim some of the life I'd lost. As we waited for Sarah to get ready, I straightened my clothes and smoothed my hair. Today, I wouldn't just be Sarah's shadow. Today, I would celebrate my birthday surrounded by family. It was a small step, but it felt like the beginning of something bigger. With Frank by my side, I took a deep breath and prepared to step out into the world again. Here's the third chapter of the story. The car ride to the restaurant was tense, to say the least. Sarah drove, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, while Frank chatted away in the back seat, seemingly oblivious to the thick atmosphere. I sat in the passenger seat, stealing glances at my daughter and brother, hardly believing this was really happening. We pulled up to a quaint little diner on the edge of town. I recognized it immediately. It had been one of my favorite places years ago, before Sarah had decided we couldn't afford to eat out anymore. As we walked in, the smell of fresh coffee and homemade pie washed over me. It was like stepping back in time. The waitress, a plump woman with a kind smile, did a double take when she saw me. "Margaret? Is that you?" she exclaimed. "My goodness, we haven't seen you in ages." I felt my cheeks flush, a mix of embarrassment and pleasure at being recognized. "Hello, Betty," I said softly. "It's good to see you." Betty's eyes darted between me, Sarah, and Frank. I could almost see the wheels turning in her head. "Well," she said brightly, "let's get you folks seated. Best table in the house for Margaret." As we settled into a cozy booth, I couldn't help but notice how Sarah fidgeted uncomfortably. She wasn't used to people paying attention to me, treating me like a person rather than a shadow. Frank, bless him, took charge of the situation. "So, Maggie," he said, grinning at me over his menu, "what'll it be?" "Birthday girl gets whatever she wants." For a moment I froze. It had been so long since anyone had asked what I wanted. Sarah always decided what we'd eat at home, usually whatever was quickest and easiest for her. I'm not sure," I stammered, overwhelmed by the choices. Frank's eyes softened. "How about the blueberry pancakes? You always loved those." The memory hit me like a wave. Sunday mornings with Frank and our parents, the smell of fresh pancakes filling the house. I nodded, feeling tears prick at my eyes. As Betty took our orders, I noticed Sarah hadn't even opened her menu. "I'm not hungry," she muttered, glaring at her phone. Frank ignored her attitude. "So, Sarah," he said cheerfully, "tell me what you've been up to." "Still working at the bank." Sarah's head snapped up. I know," she said, caught off guard. "I lost that job a while back." This was news to me. Sarah had told me she was still working. That's why I had to handle all the housework and cooking. Frank raised an eyebrow. "Oh, what are you doing now?" Sarah squirmed in her seat. "I'm between jobs at the moment." As the conversation continued, I sat there in shock. How much had Sarah been hiding from me? How long had she been unemployed, relying on my Social Security checks to support us both? When our food arrived, the sight and smell of those blueberry pancakes brought tears to my eyes. I took a bite and it was like tasting freedom. For the first time in years, I was out of the house, enjoying a meal that I hadn't cooked myself. As we ate, I felt something shifting inside me. The fear and uncertainty that had become my constant companions started to recede. In their place, I felt a spark of something I had almost forgotten: dignity. Frank caught my eye and winked. I managed a small smile in return. This birthday lunch wasn't just a meal. It was the first step towards reclaiming my life. Here's the fourth chapter of the story. The drive home from the diner was even more tense than the ride there. Sarah's jaw was clenched tight, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. Frank, sensing the mood, had fallen silent in the back seat. As for me, my mind was reeling from the revelations of the past few hours. When we got home, Sarah mumbled something about needing to lie down and disappeared into her room. Frank helped me to the living room couch, then sat beside me, his face etched with concern. Maggie, he said gently, I think it's time we had a talk. I nodded, feeling a mix of dread and relief. Part of me wanted to keep pretending everything was fine, but a larger part knew it was time for the truth to come out. How long has Sarah been unemployed? Frank asked. I shook my head. I don't know. She told me she was still working at the bank. I had no idea. Frank's expression darkened. And how long has she been treating you like this? Making you do all the housework, keeping you isolated? The tears I'd been holding back all day finally spilled over. It happened so gradually, I whispered. At first, she just asked for help around the house. Then she said it was too expensive for me to keep my car. Then my friends stopped coming by. I don't even know how long it's been. Frank took my hand, squeezing it gently. Maggie, what's Sarah's doing? It's elder abuse. She's been manipulating you, lying to you. This isn't okay. Hearing it said out loud was like a punch to the gut. I knew things weren't right, but abuse? That seemed so harsh. But she's my daughter, I protested weakly. She needs me. No, Maggie, Frank said firmly. You need to take care of yourself. Sarah's an adult. She should be supporting herself, not leeching off you and treating you like a servant. As Frank spoke, memories began flooding back. The time Sarah accidentally broke my phone, cutting me off from my friends. The way she always had an excuse for why I couldn't go out. The constant criticisms that had chipped away at my self-esteem. I've been so blind, I murmured, more to myself than to Frank. Frank patted my hand. It's not your fault, sis. Sarah took advantage of your love for her. But now that we know what's going on, we can do something about it. Just then we heard a door slam. Sarah stormed into the living room, her face red with anger. I heard everything, she spat. How dare you come in here and turn my mother against me? Frank stood up, placing himself between Sarah and me. Sarah, calm down. We're just trying to help Dash. Help? Sarah screeched. By calling me abusive? By trying to take my mother away? She needs me. I found myself shrinking back into the couch, my old fears resurfacing. But then I caught sight of a photo on the wall. A picture of me in my younger days, smiling confidently at the camera. Something inside me snapped. No, Sarah, I said, my voice shaky but growing stronger. You need me. You've been using me. And it stops now. Sarah's face went pale, then flushed with anger again. She opened her mouth to argue, but I held up my hand. I think, I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice had become, that it's time for you to leave. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah stared at me in disbelief, then at Frank, then back at me. For a moment I thought she might explode again. But instead, she turned on her heel and stormed back to her room, slamming the door behind her. Frank sat back down beside me, putting his arm around my shoulders. I'm proud of you, Maggie, he said softly. That took a lot of courage. I nodded, feeling drained but somehow lighter. What happens now? I asked. Frank squeezed my shoulder. Now we start getting your life back. One step at a time. As I sat there, processing everything that had happened, I realized that this birthday had brought me an unexpected gift. The strength to reclaim my freedom. Here's the 5th chapter of the story. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions and activity. Sarah, true to form, didn't leave quietly. She raged, she cried, she pleaded, cycling through tactics that had worked on me for years. But with Frank by my side and my newfound resolve, I stood firm. Sarah, I said during one of her calmer moments, I love you. You're my daughter, and that will never change. But this situation isn't healthy for either of us. You need to stand on your own 2 feet, and I need to reclaim my life. She stared at me, a mix of anger and disbelief in her eyes. Where am I supposed to go? What am I supposed to do? Frank, ever practical, had already been making calls. I've found a women's shelter that has a program for job training and placement, he said. They can help you get back on your feet. Sarah scoffed, but I could see a flicker of interest in her eyes. Deep down, I think she knew this change was long overdue. It took 2 more days, but finally Sarah packed her bags. As she stood at the door, suitcase in hand, I felt a pang of guilt and doubt. Was I doing the right thing? But then Sarah surprised me. She turned, her eyes wet with tears. I'm sorry, Mom, she whispered. I lost my way. I never meant for things to get this bad. I pulled her into a hug, my own tears falling. I know, sweetheart. We both made mistakes. But this is a chance for both of us to start fresh. As her cab pulled away, I felt a complex mix of sadness, relief, and hope. Frank squeezed my shoulder. You did good, Maggie. It's not easy, but it's necessary. With Sarah gone, we turned our attention to the house. Years of neglect had taken their toll, and Frank and I rolled up our sleeves to clean and repair. As we worked, we talked. I shared stories I'd kept bottled up for years, the small cruelties, the isolation, the gradual erosion of my independence. Frank listened, offering support and occasionally wiping away a tear. Why didn't you call me? He asked one evening as we sat on the newly cleaned porch. I sighed. I was ashamed, I guess. And scared. Sarah had me convinced that I was a burden, that no one else would want to deal with me. Frank shook his head. Oh, Maggie, you could never be a burden. You're one of the strongest people I know. His words warmed my heart, helping to heal some of the wounds Sarah's treatment had left. As the days passed, I began to rediscover myself. I called old friends, surprised to find that they had been worried about me and were overjoyed to hear from me. I started taking short walks around the neighborhood, nodding hello to neighbors I hadn't seen in years. One morning, about a week after Sarah left, I woke up and realized I felt different. The heavy weight of fear and obligation that had pressed on me for so long was gone. In its place was a lightness, a sense of possibility I hadn't felt in years. I walked to the kitchen where Frank was making coffee. He looked up and smiled. Good morning, Maggie. How are you feeling today? I thought for a moment, then smiled back. I feel free, I said. Like I'm finally waking up from a long bad dream. Frank nodded, understanding in his eyes. That's great, sis. So, what do you want to do with your freedom? As I pondered his question, I realized that for the first time in years, the choice was truly mine. And that realization filled me with joy and excitement for what the future might hold. Here's the 6th chapter of the story. With each passing day, I felt more like my old self. The house, once a prison, was becoming a home again. Frank and I worked together to brighten up the place, new curtains, a fresh coat of paint, and flowers in the garden. Each small change was a step towards reclaiming my space and my life. One sunny morning, as I watered the newly planted petunias, I heard a familiar voice. Margaret? Is that really you? I turned to see my old friend Helen standing at the fence. Her eyes were wide with surprise and delight. Helen! I exclaimed, feeling a rush of joy. It's been so long. Helen hurried through the gate and enveloped me in a warm hug. Oh, Margaret, we've all been so worried about you. You just disappeared on us. As we sat on the porch sipping lemonade, I found myself opening up to Helen about everything that had happened. She listened with a mix of horror and sympathy, squeezing my hand supportively. Oh, my dear, she said when I finished. I'm so sorry we didn't do more. We should have pushed harder to see you. I shook my head. It's not your fault, Helen. Sarah was very good at keeping people away. But I'm back now, and I'm not going anywhere. Helen's eyes lit up. Well, in that case, you simply must come to our book club meeting next week. Everyone will be thrilled to see you. The idea both excited and terrified me. It had been so long since I'd been in a social situation. What if I didn't remember how to act? What if they didn't want me there? Sensing my hesitation, Helen patted my arm. Don't worry, dear. We'll start slow. It's just a small gathering at my house. No pressure. I nodded, taking a deep breath. Okay, I said, surprising myself with my eagerness. I'd love to come. The next week flew by in a flurry of anticipation. I found myself fretting over what to wear, what to say. Frank watched my nervous preparations with an amused smile. You're going to be fine, Maggie, he assured me. Just be yourself. They're your friends, remember. The night of the book club, I stood in front of the mirror, hardly recognizing the woman looking back at me. Gone was the dowdy, hunched figure I'd become. In her place stood a woman with bright eyes and a tentative smile, wearing a pretty blouse I'd found in the back of my closet. As Helen's husband drove us to their house, I felt a mix of excitement and nerves. But the moment I walked through the door and saw the familiar faces of my old friends, all anxiety melted away. There were tears, hugs, and exclamations of joy. My friends clustered around me, each wanting to reconnect to hear how I'd been. Their genuine happiness at seeing me again warmed my heart and chased away the last lingering doubts about my place in the world. As we settled in to discuss the book, a novel I'd managed to read in record time that week, I felt a sense of belonging I'd almost forgotten. These women had been my support system for years before Sarah isolated me. Now, sitting among them again, I realized how much I'd missed their companionship. The evening flew by in a whirl of laughter, discussion, and shared memories. As Helen's husband drove me home, I felt lighter than I had in years. Frank was waiting up for me when I got back. "How was it?" he asked, a knowing smile on his face. I couldn't contain my grin. "It was wonderful," I said, my voice full of wonder. I'd forgotten how good it feels to just be with friends. Frank nodded, looking pleased. "That's great, Maggie. You deserve to have that joy in your life." As I got ready for bed that night, I caught sight of myself in the mirror again. The woman looking back at me now was smiling, her eyes bright with happiness. For the first time in a long time, I felt like myself again. I fell asleep that night with a heart full of gratitude for Frank's intervention, for the strength I'd found within myself, and for the friends who welcomed me back with open arms. The road ahead might not be easy, but I was no longer walking it alone. Here's the 7th chapter of the story. As weeks turned into months, I found myself settling into a new rhythm of life. The book club became a regular fixture in my calendar, along with other activities I'd rediscovered or newly embraced. I joined a senior yoga class at the local community center, started volunteering at the library, and even took up watercolor painting. Something I'd always wanted to try but never had the courage to do before. Frank, bless him, had been my rock through it all. But as I grew stronger and more independent, we both knew it was time for him to return to his own life. "Are you sure you'll be okay, Maggie?" he asked, concern etched on his face as he packed his suitcase. I smiled, feeling a confidence I hadn't experienced in years. "I'll be fine, Frank. You've done more for me than I can ever repay. It's time for you to go home to Susan and the kids." He pulled me into a tight hug. "You know I'm just a phone call away, right? Anytime, day or night." I nodded, feeling tears prick at my eyes. "I know. Thank you, Frank. For everything." As I watched his car pull away, I felt a momentary pang of fear. This would be the first time I'd be truly on my own in years. But I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and turned back to the house. This was my life now, and I was ready to live it. The first few days alone were challenging. I found myself jumping at small noises, half expecting Sarah to appear and berate me for some imagined failing. But as each day passed without incident, I grew more comfortable in my solitude. I started making small changes around the house, rearranging furniture, hanging new pictures, creating a space that truly reflected me. Each decision, no matter how minor, felt like a victory. One afternoon, as I was tending to my flourishing garden, I heard a car pull up. My heart raced for a moment, old fears surfacing. But when I looked up, I saw Helen waving from her car. "Margaret," she called out cheerfully. "We're headed to the farmer's market. Want to come along?" Without hesitation, I called back, "I'd love to. Give me just a minute to get ready." As I quickly changed and grabbed my purse, I marveled at how easily I'd said yes. There was no anxious checking to see if Sarah would approve, no worry about leaving chores undone. I was free to come and go as I pleased, and the realization filled me with joy. The farmer's market was a riot of colors, smells, and sounds. I found myself laughing with Helen and our other friends, sampling fresh produce, and even splurging on a bouquet of sunflowers for my kitchen table. As we walked back to the car, arms laden with our purchases, Helen nudged me gently. "It's so good to have you back, Margaret. You seem happier than I've seen you in years." I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through my chest. "I am happy, Helen. For the first time in a long time, I feel like myself again." That evening, as I arranged my sunflowers in a vase and prepared a simple dinner with my market finds, I felt a deep sense of contentment. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt oppressive. Instead, it was peaceful, a sanctuary of my own making. I sat down to eat, looking around at the home I'd reclaimed. There were still challenges ahead, I knew. I hadn't heard from Sarah since she left, and that wound would take time to heal. But I was no longer the frightened, dependent woman I'd been just a few months ago. As I sipped my tea and watched the sunset from my porch, I felt a surge of gratitude for this new chapter of my life. At 75, I was finally free to be myself, to pursue my interests, to nurture my friendships. It wasn't the life I'd imagined, but it was rich with possibilities. I went to bed that night with a smile on my face, looking forward to whatever tomorrow might bring. The future, once so daunting, now seemed full of promise, and I was ready to embrace it one day at a time. Here's the 8th chapter of the story. 6 months had passed since Sarah left. Life had fallen into a comfortable routine, filled with friends, hobbies, and a newfound sense of purpose. I'd even started mentoring at a local women's shelter, sharing my story to help others find their strength. It was a crisp autumn morning when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I approached the door with a mix of curiosity and caution. When I opened it, I felt my heart skip a beat. There stood Sarah, looking thinner and somehow smaller than I remembered. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she clutched a small bouquet of daisies, my favorite flowers. "Mom," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can we talk?" For a moment I froze, a whirlwind of emotions coursing through me. Part of me wanted to slam the door, to protect the peace and independence I'd worked so hard to achieve. But another part, the mother in me, saw the pain and regret in Sarah's eyes. Taking a deep breath, I nodded and stepped aside. "Come in, Sarah." We sat in the living room, an awkward silence hanging between us. Sarah's eyes darted around, taking in the changes I'd made to the house. Finally, she spoke. "Mama, I don't even know where to begin. I'm so sorry. For everything." I watched her carefully, years of manipulation making me wary. "Why are you here, Sarah?" She took a shaky breath. "I've been in therapy. After I left. Well, I hit rock bottom. But it made me face some hard truths about myself, about how I treated you." As Sarah talked, I listened with a mix of hope and skepticism. She told me about the program she'd entered, the job she'd found, the amends she was trying to make in her life. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said, tears streaming down her face. "What I did was unforgivable. But I wanted you to know that I understand now. And I'm trying to be better." I sat there absorbing her words. The pain she'd caused was still raw, but I could see the genuine remorse in her eyes. "Sarah," I said finally, my voice gentle but firm, "I appreciate you coming here and saying these things. It means a lot to hear you acknowledge what happened." She nodded, wiping her eyes. "But," I continued, "trust is something that has to be earned. It'll take time for me to feel safe around you again." "I understand," Sarah said softly. "I don't expect things to go back to how they were. I miss you, Mom, and I want to try to make things right if you'll let me." I considered her words carefully. The old me might have immediately welcomed her back, desperate for her approval. But I was stronger now, more sure of myself. "We can start small," I said. "Maybe we could meet for coffee next week? In a public place." Sarah's face lit up with hope. "I'd like that very much." As I showed her out, she paused at the door. "You look good, Mom." "Happy." "I'm glad." I smiled, realizing it was true. "I am happy, Sarah. I've found myself again." After she left, I sat on the porch, processing what had just happened. I wasn't naive enough to think everything would be magically fixed. The road to rebuilding our relationship would be long and likely difficult. But as I sat there, watching the leaves fall in my front yard, I felt a sense of peace. I was no longer the helpless, trapped woman I'd been. I was strong enough now to set boundaries, to protect myself, and maybe, just maybe, to forge a new, healthier relationship with my daughter. I picked up the phone to call Frank. As it rang, I smiled to myself. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I knew I could face them. Because now, finally, I was free. Here's the 9th chapter of the story. The weeks following Sarah's unexpected visit were a roller coaster of emotions. True to our agreement, we met for coffee at a small cafe in town. The conversation was stilted and awkward at first, both of us unsure how to navigate this new dynamic. "How's your new job going?" I asked, stirring my tea. Sarah smiled tentatively. "It's good. Challenging, but in a good way. I'm learning a lot." As we talked, I noticed subtle changes in Sarah. She was more attentive, actually listening when I spoke instead of dismissing me. She asked about my life, seeming genuinely interested in my newfound activities and friends. Over the next few months, our meetings became more regular. We'd meet for lunch, take walks in the park, or sometimes just sit and talk on my porch. Slowly, very slowly, I felt the walls between us start to crumble. But it wasn't always smooth sailing. There were moments when old patterns threatened to resurface. During one of our meetings, Sarah made an offhand comment about my outfit that sent me spiraling back to those dark days of constant criticism. Instead of shrinking away, though, I took a deep breath and spoke up. Sarah, that comment hurt me. I need you to be more mindful of how you speak to me. Sarah looked shocked for a moment, then ashamed. You're right, Mom. I'm sorry. I'm still working on changing those habits. It was moments like these that showed me how far we'd both come. Sarah was learning to take responsibility for her actions, and I was learning to stand up for myself. As winter turned to spring, I decided it was time to take a bigger step. I invited Sarah over for dinner at my house. It would be the first time she'd be back in the home since she left. The evening of the dinner, I felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. I'd prepared Sarah's favorite meal, but as I set the table, I realized this dinner symbolized so much more than just food. When Sarah arrived, she paused in the doorway, taking in the changes I'd made to the house. Mom, it looks amazing in here, she said softly. It feels happier. I smiled, feeling a surge of pride. It is happier. I am happier. As we ate, we talked about our lives, our hopes, our regrets. There were tears, but also laughter, something I couldn't remember sharing with Sarah in years. After dinner, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Sarah turned to me. Mom, I can't change what I did in the past. But I want you to know how proud I am of you. You're so strong, stronger than I ever gave you credit for. I felt tears prick at my eyes. Thank you, Sarah. That means a lot to hear. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of our shared history between us, but no longer as a barrier. As Sarah was leaving, she hugged me tightly. I love you, Mom. Thank you for giving me another chance. Watching her drive away, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. Our relationship wasn't perfect, and we still had a long way to go. But we were on the path to healing, both as individuals and as mother and daughter. I went back inside, looking around at the home I'd reclaimed, filled with reminders of the life I'd rebuilt. A framed painting from my art class, photos of outings with friends, books from the book club scattered on the coffee table. At 75, my life had taken an unexpected turn. But as I got ready for bed that night, I realized that this chapter of my life might just be the best one yet. I was free, I was strong, and I was finally truly living. Here's the 10th chapter of the story. As my 76th birthday approached, I found myself reflecting on the whirlwind of changes the past year had brought. The woman I was now barely resembled the scared, isolated person I'd been just 12 months ago. Frank called regularly, always checking in to make sure I was doing well. During one of our chats, he asked about my birthday plans. You know, Maggie, he said, his voice warmed through the phone. Last year's surprise visit didn't go quite as planned. How about we do it right this time? I chuckled, remembering the chaos of last year. What did you have in mind? How about a party? Nothing too big, just your close friends. Maybe Sarah. He said the last part cautiously, knowing our relationship was still a work in progress. I thought about it for a moment. A year ago, the idea of being the center of attention would have terrified me. But now? You know what, Frank? That sounds wonderful.